Okay, greetings, brothers and sisters. So this is going to be, this is an introduction I'm doing to this video. It's over an hour long. I just did an hour-long voiceover. I've read the techniques. And the video is meant to be listened to in its entirety, and also hopefully coming back and listening to it again if you choose to use this technique to deal with sexual perversion and, obsessive sexual thoughts and sexual addiction or whatever it is, right? This technique will only work in conjunction with doing your cleaning and doing the Sahaj Marg sittings, the Sahaj Marg system, reading the literature, right? All these things. It's not something you could take to, a sexual addiction support group like an AA group and these things. And the techniques themselves have to be understood. And I give, over an hour's worth of explanation to the techniques and why they're necessary, and stories about this and some of the history and the mission about this, and all the things that I know about. And so it's important to listen to the whole video and think about what's being said here and use the technique the ways it's intended. It's intended to be used for 10 minutes and not any more than that. As you hear the, I'll explain that as we go through it. Like, don't abuse the technique. Use it the way that it's designed as a part of the Sahaj Marg system to help you evolve spiritually. You have that this is somehow blocking your spiritual evolution, addiction to sexual behavior, pornography, or, you're having deviant thoughts and you can't free yourself from the sexual thoughts when you meditate and things like this. And so it's weighing you down and it's blocking your spiritual evolution. And so a technique has been given here. And so again, and maybe come back and listen. If you start using this technique and use it for a month or two, come back and listen to the whole video again to just put some perspective on it, because there's a lot of information, and just get a sense of, I talk about this at the end, that this is about moderation. It's not about it's not about celibacy. It's not about, it's, taking something that's abnormal behavior, pervasive behavior, perverted behavior, and divinizing it in a way and bringing it up to a higher level, but still having, appropriate sexual relationships and, in terms of a marital situation, the rest of it, which is the desired result in this system. And so, again, the whole video needs to be listened to and then just contemplated about when engaging in any of these techniques. You have to rise up to the spirit of the technique and not, change it or deviate from it or do it in a way that's not prescribed. Like this, like all these things, there's a prescription given by that's coming from a higher place, and these techniques have been withdrawn at times because people were misusing them or whatever it was, right? Okay, so here is the video. Okay, greetings, brothers and sisters. So this is a video about normalizing sexual tendencies. It's not getting rid of sexual behavior. It's not about celibacy. This is deviant sexual tendencies, things like sexual addiction or deviant sexual fantasies, all these things. There's a show called Men, Women, and Children, which documents the internet's pushing men, women, and children towards deviant sexual behavior. And the movie's like 10 years old, right? So there was a kid in the movie, he was a high school kid, and he's into such like deviant pornography that he can't get aroused to, would be the sort of ideal girlfriend cheerleader type, who herself is her mom's posting nude photos of her online to boost her whatever thing she's doing, right? I mean, the whole thing is like just it's a movie I would only watch once, right? It's like depressing, but it was, again, early on, 10 years ago. We all know that these kids are getting exposed to pornography at an early age, and with anything like that, it's like a gateway drug where the stuff that you watch in the beginning is mild compared to the stuff that you end up watching later, right? And so this is what these kids are growing up with. There's another great talk by this guy, Gary Wilson, called The Great Porn Experiment, a TED Talk that may or may not exist because people have said they've looked it up and they couldn't find it. And he talked about how all these kids were, like 100% were watching porn, and then all the negative effects of pornography, just as an example, right? And these kids are growing up in a completely different moral world than we are. But even back when this these techniques were given to Babaji was like the 50s and the 60s, right? Where sexual behavior and obsessive sexual thoughts were considered a problem for meditation. They were interfering with some people's meditation, and so Babaji came up with these techniques, and then I think he withdrew them at some point, so I'm not sure the whole history behind it. But it's something that has to be done in a way to normalize, not to extinguish, right? Not to get rid of your sexual behaviors, like all of them. You know, the Babaji used to say, God was not a fool to invent two sexes if one would have been sufficient. I think Babaji had 5 kids in total, 4 or 5 kids. Pretty sure it's 5. And Charji had a kid, and Balaji had multiple kids as well, 1 or 2 children, maybe more, I'm not sure. And they were married, and that was, you know, like there's no celibacy in Sahaj Marg. There's no saying that the, you know, sexual behaviors are bad. It's just they have to be normalized, which I think most people can understand and agree with. That there's, you know, deviance. You know, Charji once said that promiscuity or just, you know, sexual behavior is where sort of the gateway to immorality in a spiritual movement. You know, he talked about it earlier in the preceptor talks. I don't think I read this to anybody, but that there's the Muladhara point, there's these power points in, you know, Hatha Yoga that run up and down the spine, the Kundalini, and these other points above it. I think it's called the Muladhara point. I think that's what he said, but I'm not sure. Whatever the name, it's not important. But this point exists to regulate sexual behavior. Then there's a point above it that regulates your gut, like your appetites, which are both very important points in terms of, you know, your lower tendencies, your lower emotions, your lower, you know, your lower appetites and things. And if the Kundalini gets awoken by some dopey guru that doesn't know what they're doing, not fully open, but just even just a little bit of a, just touch to some point, like where the Kundalini awakens a little bit, like not, you know, people have their Kundalini open. There's all these New Age people all thinking they have their Kundalini open, and they are just lying to themselves. They're, you know, it's not true. Like it's not something that's easily done. But occasionally a person goes to a guru and there's some, you know, issue with the Kundalini, and there's people who suffer dramatically from this. And then the energy goes up the spine, and there's deviance there, and the person becomes deviant and deviant appetites and tendencies. You know, that's what happens to a lot of these gurus, and that, you know, then enters into the satsang, the group of people that are there, all those things, right? And just, you know, the whole thing goes south because it's no longer a spiritual movement. It becomes some sort of hedonistic, you know, where people can't control their appetites and their almost like their animalistic tendencies, which is, of course, the opposite effect, where the thing becomes, instead of a spiritual organization, becomes like some sort of hedonistic cult. And so in the Sahaj Marg system, it's about natural, healthy sexual relationships with your spouse. Like that's the goal, that the family and women are supposed to be upheld, the sanctity of the family, and that there would be normal sexual behavior between couples. And, you know, it would be, again, like there's a reason for it. We have, like Babaji said, if God is not a fool to make 2 sexes, and if one would be sufficient. But we all know about the deviant sexual tendencies, that proclivities that human beings have, and it's getting worse for kids and these things. And in the Sahaj Marg system, you know, Babaji didn't want to impose this because he had a lot of boomer hippies that were liberals, and they were, you know, consumption orientated people. They were drinking at gatherings and using drugs like LSD, and he had to fix people who got wrecked their spiritual condition. And when he died, he had, on his deathbed, he basically said to Charji, I've let undisciplined sneak into this, you know, to sneak into this mission, and you're going to have to change that. You know, and I couldn't do it because I said only forbidden is forbidden. And that was the mantra of these boomer hippies, Well, Babaji said only forbidden is forbidden, and they took advantage of it. And what Babaji said that is he didn't want people suffering the sin of disobedience of the master, because he knew he would say, don't do this, don't do that. There's no don'ts in Sahaj Marg. There's no orders, right? Everything is a positive suggestion what to do, and they don't focus on what not to do. But he knew that if he said, you shouldn't do this, and this is forbidden, or that's forbidden, that people would do it anyway and disobey the master of the system, and that would add, other layers of grossness to the person. And so his idea was that through cleaning and transmission, their tendencies would be curbed, right? Their tendencies would be eradicated. That it would just take some time for people, and it would regulate itself. But Babaji was, often stunned by what people would do, like the drugs and some of the sexual behavior and some of the things that were very prominent in, Europe and America. And there's just a different culture and things that were more open about it. Of course, things exist in India, lots of deviance, but it's more hidden because there's a lot more shame associated with it. But he realized that this was a problem, so he gave these techniques, which I'll read to you in just a moment. I just want to, preface this by all the stuff I know about this. And so Charji came in and said, women and men have to sit on different sides. So there wasn't any men sitting next to women and, and with their eyes closed and rubbing up against them like Joe Biden or something, or any of these things, sitting there and having sexual fantasies or whatever. And that men's energies and women's energies were different. And so Charji came in and said men and women should sit on different sides. And those of us who came in initially, with that, it was the way it was, knew it would be better. It knew it was better, like, of course, right? But these boomer hippies attacked Charji, even though Babaji had said that this is what needs to happen, but he couldn't do it because he knew that they would react. And there's this one woman who recalls, like, calling him, some people called him like a male chauvinist pig, and all these things, all these, boomer hippies kind of shit that they were saying. And this one woman recalls, like, this liberal woman, American liberal woman. She gave a talk. I heard her talk about this. And she remembered giving him a point where she just thought she was so right, like these ways that people debate things on the internet now and how people go back and forth. And she thought she just made such an excellent point, and he said, your mind is like a knife. You can use it to cut your bread or you can use it to cut your throat. He said it with like a lot of like energy, and it kind of, she got like zong, like a zinger, like she, like almost like a spiritual slap or something. And then she realized, and now she accepts, or she was, at least for a while, I don't know, because all these people have gone back on their liberal tendencies under Daji, but she realized that he was right about this thing. And he had said, this was from Babaji, and he wasn't imposing this because he felt like it should be done. It was something that Babaji always wanted to do and never could because of it, because only forbidden is forbidden. And so, the idea that it would help people to focus in on their spiritual side and not their physical bodies, which, amongst other things, people being hungry, physically hungry, or, having their, bodily appetites and obviously sexual fantasies and things were not, people meditating on sexual, fantasies rather than meditating on whatever they're supposed to meditate on. So there are many times also that people would go to a gathering and they would not have any sexual thoughts for like weeks. They'd go to an ashram and they were just in a higher state of consciousness. And they weren't paying as much attention to their lower body. They were eating less, maybe physically. They weren't, sometimes sleeping on, hard marble floors in the meditation room or something. I mean, it was just, the physical comforts weren't there. But it was just, you were so, like, focused or so connected to the divinity within you and saturated with the spiritual energy that you wouldn't, feel these other things, right? And so you wouldn't have these sexual thoughts. Charji himself wrote in one of his diary entries, I think when he was a younger person, that he went to one of these gatherings. He was traveling with Babaji. He said he didn't have a sexual thought like once, right? But sometimes the opposite is the case, because that there are people like, married couples who have been having sexual relations for a while, and they do some of the meditation, and it opens their heart. Their heart is blocked, and of course, Viagra is a the male and female sexual organs are connected to the heart. Viagra was originally a heart medication, and so the heart is very important to the not just the physical heart. I mean, the physical heart is connected to the sexual organs. I mean, there's a relationship there. But the loving heart, when you start feeling love, the etheric heart is also a part of that. The spiritual aspect of your heart is also connected to your reproductive organs, which is why love and sex are often, they go hand in hand, right? Especially amongst married couples. And so people would come and do the meditation, and they might have not been feeling, especially older people, sexual energy or something, or maybe there's like rigidity in their system, in their relationships, and then they come and their heart opens up. And this is for both men and women. And so with that, there's the return of this, sexual desires that weren't there before. So like both things can happen. The system can do both things. The system can, limit and, help curb the tendencies, especially the negative ones, and you bring you up to a higher state of consciousness where you're not focused on your bodily urges and whatever it is, your physical body as much, and you go into a much more spiritual state. But also people who have, there's some rigidity in their system, and that also includes their sexual behavior, because they're all locked up, and their hearts are are like have gone cold and stoned and hardened with grossness. And then there's some cleaning, and there's the feeling of love returns. People who are deprived of love and vital energy, and then their sexual energy and all their creative force is dormant in their system because they're walking around like zombies, and then it's like they come back to life, right? So both things can happen in the Sahaj Marg system. There's also a story I heard, which was confirmed for me, that there was a time where, kind of a cute little story, funny story, and not so great either, that Charji and Babaji were traveling together in Europe and America. So they often shared the same room. Charji would get up and help Babaji. Babaji was in his 70s. And, Babaji had some physical issues and things like this. And so there was a knock at the door, and this woman, Abhyasi from Europe, came in and said that she was really attracted to Charji. She was like overwhelmed with like sexual desire for him. He was going to be Babaji's successor. And she said that she was attracted to him. Of course, he was married, and he was like, please, go to leave. And she's like, no, I love you, but I just love you. And Babaji, who was like sleeping in his bed, peeked up from under the covers and said, don't you love me? Because, the love of the master, and the, and, very innocently said that, right? And then this woman, there was a time where me and my ex, there was all these people who wanted to write books, wanted to do some sort of, like some of them had, like this woman had diaries. She had traveled. She was a Danish woman. She was very kind of, and she was now very older. She was in her 60s, 70s. And she said that she wanted to publish her diaries. But some of the stuff was, she basically alluded, it was this woman, she alluded to this situation. I think she might have even been married at the time as well, right? But sometimes, the loving energy, it gets, misinterpreted as something that's, that's something beyond that. Like it's something more than just like the spiritual loving energy that's given in the system, and people mistake it for something more. In fact, I was told by Don Savarin that when you're giving sittings to women that you wanted to turn slightly to the side because, their hearts start to open, and this is, it also can be misconstrued to be, something of a sexual nature, right? So like all these things were part of it. These are all the things I know about this specific subject, right? And there's another reference in Charji's diary where some woman, like Babaji would never hug anybody because he had all this spiritual energy and it would go through their spiritual points. Like, they were told there's stuff in this preceptor book that says, when you're in a, higher level preceptors, you don't want to, touch your kids on the head or something like that to awaken one of these spiritual points. Anything down the back on the spine, because the spiritual energy can be flowing through you. If you don't know how to regulate it or control it, then you shouldn't touch your kids in the spine, or younger kids, and especially even other people, Abhyasis. Like, there shouldn't be like the hugging and things like this in terms of the energy. And this woman wanted to give Babaji a kiss, and Charji said, "Well, what'd you do?" He said, "Well, I was going to send her to you." And Charji said, "Well, if I fall, then you're screwed." And so there was this conversation that they had about this. But so there's this this kind of stuff that's there. And again, this was in the 60s and the 70s, and that was before the internet and pornography, and the kids that grow up today much more obsessive in their in their sexual proclivities, and much more deviant sexual behaviors. Of course, we now know about all the gender things that have slipped in to the the Hollywood morality, and so it's just kind of a mess. Like, these kids are a mess. So this was available, when I was starting when I was 30 years old. So this is like 30 years ago. It was available before that. This book came out in 1989, so in the 90s, and so let's read this here. I think I have one more story to tell, but let's go through this first. Babaji says to achieve correction. This is Babaji says to Charji. Charji says that, and then in bold lettering, this is what, again, the book is so that Charji's explaining Babaji's. He put out a booklet, a training booklet, and Charji's explaining everything and interpreting it for people. To achieve correction of such gross tendencies, the point A of the heart region is used for meditation. It is highly effective in creating self-indulging tendencies. Highly effective in correcting, not creating, in correcting self-indulging tendencies. It is very useful to check the distracting power of the opposite sex, especially in male Abhyasis. And then Charji says, now all of you know where point A is. It is written in efficacy of Raja Yoga. So you could look up the book Efficacy of Raja Yoga, and there is a picture, a chart. You might even be able to just Google that, and you could see the point there. But this is talking about on the chest, in the front of you, the chest area. And it says, it's written in the efficacy of Raja Yoga, starting from the left nipple. You measure 2 fingers width. So you put 2 fingers to the left of your, to the center of your left nipple, and locate a point, and then below that 3 fingers. So it's 2 fingers towards the center of your heart, and 3 fingers, and 3 fingers width is point A, and another 2 fingers down is point B. Locate it yourself by measuring it with your own fingers, and then meditate on the point. So you can find efficacy of Raja Yoga in PDF form. The meditation group that was started by Babaji's kids, they have one book, and then the Sahaj Marg system has another. It's the same book, but these are available in PDF form, so you can read these books, the 5 books of Babaji. And so the way that you just, you gotta kind of have just a general sense, and then I would always have the thought of point A or point B, because they're points that you clean in other people as a preceptor. And so point 1, these are both subpoints of point 1. It's where your soul starts off at. And so if you look at the charts and the points, and I've showed this in various, I'll put up the picture here as well in this video. But you start off with point 1, and that's where your soul is. But it's also where you accumulate the majority of your grossness. So the majority of cleaning that takes place is in point 1 and point 2. And there's these subpoints in point 1. And it's where you manifest your material reality. And so the way that works is that there is point 0.7 where in your mind region is where like ideas come from, like your ideas to whatever you're making plans and you're manifesting stuff. And then it goes down into point A, I believe, and then out point B to the material world. And so if there's a lot of accumulated grossness in your heart region, then that affects your ability to manifest things and perverts whatever things that you're manifesting in some way or another. And so there has to be a lot of cleaning and the two heart points. When you're doing it's like cleaning. The cleaning you do every night is just it's like brushing your teeth, right? But when you go to a preceptor, you take the sittings on the on this channel, it's a deeper cleaning that happens that goes for more than just your last couple days. I mean, deeper cleaning from past lives even, and then even more so when you would see the master of the system in the gathering, and when he would make people preceptors, there'd be really deep cleaning, and things would come up. You'd have to experience them. You might go through physical issues when you go through really deep cleaning, right? But that's like going to the dentist, right? As opposed to just brushing your teeth, where you're brushing your teeth from that day. You're getting rid of whatever potential plaque that's building up that day. So the need for doing the individual cleaning is to make sure you don't create any more grossness, and also cleaning things that come up, things that maybe from past experience and some scar awakens in you, and then you have this whatever it is, right? But also not to be obsessed with cleaning, like not thinking of yourself as gross, not being obsessed with it, not it's just something that if there's obstacles, they're removed. Don't focus on them, and don't be obsessed with the whole thing, right? So that's a big part of this thing. And so these points A and B, and there's another meditation which I'll give in a video that's coming up. The next the next section is about that, and I'll give that in a video either tomorrow or whatever today is, Wednesday, December 4th. So whatever, whenever I get a chance to do that, like the next couple of days, I'll read that. And there's cleaning and meditation on point A and point B that are different. There's one that's when you meditate on point B, it brings you to a thoughtless condition. I believe it's point B. We'll go through that in a bit. And so just having a general sense of the area where it is, and then you just have the idea that you're meditating on point A, right? Like you can just, you can locate it so you know where it is, so you're focusing sort of on that part of your body. But again, it's an etheric part in its exact location. It's more easy to locate with your mind than to physically try to measure and look at it. You can, get the general sense. It's, you're starting off with your left nipple, 2 fingers on the inside of your left nipple, and then 3 fingers down from there. There's a point, you can kind of figure out that where that kind of is, or where it is from there. But then you're using your mind and saying point A. So you're locating it with your mind and saying there's point A. And so getting back to it. And then he says, so locate yourself by measuring it with your own fingers and then meditate on the point. And so then Babaji writes this under a subheading here. Meditation on point A, the Abhyasi should be instructed to fix his attention to the point A with the thought that all men and women of the world are his brothers and sisters. And he's going to go on to say here it's for 10 minutes. And it should not exceed 10 minutes, which is a very important point, so this is what Charji says. This is a very positive meditation. We don't say, oh, such and such a person is not my sister, because then she is something else. Especially for males, you see. You have these positive thought, meditate on this point, all in this world are my brothers and sisters. And please don't make bringing up the exclusion principle and say except, and then there's laughter, and he laughs. Yes, there's always a temptation to exclude something, you see, which for the moment is exciting. This is the principle, that all are my brothers and sisters. And this also helps to bring in a sense of brotherhood beyond the whatever it is, right? And then it says, the one that my master or my destiny chooses to be my wife will eventually be my wife. If she is already my wife, she is already my wife. If she's already my mother, she's our sister, she is already there. This is the blood relationship. But in this principle, all are my brothers and sisters, because Babji told me once when my son got into the system, he said, You must treat him as a spiritual brother, not a spiritual son. And then I once introduced my brother's son, who is probably 40 years my junior at the age, in the age of Sahaj Marg, 40 years my junior in age, to Sahaj Marg. And immediately after the sitting, he got up and hugged me and said, "Hello, brother." He laughs, laughter. For him, it was a liberation of sorts, you see, that an uncle has now become a brother. So this is to be done with a mind which longs for correction. I know there are many people who are perverted and who don't wish to change their pervert tendencies or their wrong deeds. Of course, people will, I think he's meant to say, change their perverted tendencies or wrong deeds. Of course, the people you can, of course, such people, not of course, of such people you can expect nothing. And for them, this technique will not work because in the beginning they will refuse to employ it. They will say, "Why? I am happy as I am." This is for a sincere seeker who, being aware of the tendencies of his mind and who, deploying his own activities in the field of action, wishes to correct himself sincerely, honestly towards correcting himself and divinizing himself eventually. For such a person, this technique is the most effective. You know, I read this article. You can find it somewhere. I've talked about this in previous videos. And there's a guy who was a sex offender. You know, of course, I worked with teenage sex offenders and all these, these kids who had been abused and then were now acting out their abuse with other kids. You know, it's just this cycle of sort of deviant behaviors that goes around. And of course, sex offenders are the most, even in prison, they're considered the worst of the worst, right? The dregs of society. And this guy was somewhere, I think, near Washington, D.C. And he had been, a lifelong pedo. And he was being sent back and forth to prison. And he didn't want to be this way anymore. So he was in jail, and he put an apple in his mouth and took out a razor blade, and he cut off his testicles. He used the apple so he wouldn't scream. He castrated himself, right? And this is a commitment because he just didn't want to have these deviant tendencies. And, there's, like, it happens for these people who are abused at a young age and they develop these deviant sexual tendencies, attraction towards kids. Of course, now with pornography, there's all these things that people develop in some way or another. They're like invaded. And it takes control of them, right? They can't, stop from thinking about these things. So this is a wonderful technique for something like that. People who are desperate, again, people who are practicing the Sahaj Marg system, I don't think it would work for just any, person in prison or whatever, because there's just too much grossness there. There's a cleaning process that has to be employed, right? So, the Sahaj Marg system, a lot of it's about, in terms of like Babaji used to say, character building is the responsibility of the Abhyasi. Because what would happen is that people would get the cleaning, but they wouldn't want to relinquish their mental tendencies, whatever they might be. That Babaji, there was this cleaning that would happen, and people would no longer have the grossness and some scars that's causing their deviant behavior, or any kind of behavior. It doesn't have to be some like sexual behavior. It doesn't have to be. It could be, anything like anger or hatred. Like Babaji would clean out the hatred, but people would still want to hate. They would still want to be prejudiced, right? They would still have these, deviant tendencies. The cleaning would be effective, but the person's mind and the person's ego would not want to relinquish behaviors or thoughts or attitudes. And so it would just recreate the grossness. I mean, it's just horrible. Like it's just hard to be a human being, and people are, just can't break free from their lower nature. I mean, we've seen it over and over again. We see it now with Daji and his people. I mean, all the people around Daji were around Charji all the time. And he, gave them instruction, and he cleaned them, and he saw their tendencies, and he did everything he could to correct these tendencies in them. And then as soon as he died, they, things that he had been, wouldn't allow them to, to express that in their positions. They had, positions in the mission. and they started to do what, they did what Dodgy's doing now. They're part of the Dodgy debacle, right? And going against the will of the previous masters of the system and turning this into some perversion of what it used to be because of their inability to correct themselves, because they had been cleaned and given higher levels of spiritual attainment, and yet were unable to elevate themselves. And this is why Babaji said that you're going to have to bring discipline into the mission. And so this is, part of it. So let's go back to this technique here. And so it says here, and again, people should re-listen to this thing in its entirety. Like, just not to the technique, everything that I'm saying. This is information that people would have. The information that I'm telling you, all the stuff that I have told you here, it's all important, like understanding the nuances of this thing. And it says here, meditate on point A with the thought that all men and women of the world are brothers and sisters. The meditation is to be done just before going to bed. That is, instead of cleaning process, which you do. If you don't do it at the time stipulated, you normally do it at night before the prayer and meditation, then this should be just before the prayer and meditation for not more than 10 minutes. You would still do your cleaning, but then you would do this afterwards. And then there's the prayer and meditation that you do right before bed, which you say the mission prayer a few times and meditate on its meaning. And there's also, of course, Maxim 10, which applies to this, and I'm not going to talk about that here, but that's also something that you would do before bed. And he says, for not more than 10 minutes. So Babaji said, meditate on point A with the thought that all men and women of the world are your brothers and sisters. This meditation is not to be done. This meditation is to be done before going to bed. And then Charji said that other stuff about the cleaning process. And then Charji says, for not more than 10 minutes. Now, people may ask why, because if this feeling becomes too deeply implanted in the heart, instead of just producing a clean attitude towards humanity, it may produce what we deplore in Sahaj Marg, a running away from life altogether. That all brothers and sisters, how can I even ever marry this girl? That all are brothers and sisters, how can I marry this girl? So you feel the need to give up life, give up marriage, become celibate on the way to the jungle. It goes to the opposite extreme. Everything has an optimum time or an optimum effect. And for this, the meditation, the optimum is 10 minutes, but not longer than 10 minutes. So that's very important, right? And so, just to have a sense, then what he said, deploring this idea of being a sannyasi or a celibate person, because you're supposed to have a natural life, two wings of the bird. It's very important in the Sahaj Marg system. You have a job, you have a family, you have, interactions in the world, but you also have a spiritual life, right? And balancing the two, not going to extremes of like the celibacy aspect. And of course, we know what that's caused in all these various religions, because they don't have this cleaning technique. And so they don't get rid of the tendencies, they just suppress them. And we see all the deviant behaviors in the Catholic Church and these other religious organizations because of it, right? So this is to make something natural and wholesome and innocent and good, where the sexual behavior is still there, but it's done in a way that's natural and healthy through the love of a marital relationship, and not something that's, a perversion of that in some way, right? The layers of perversion that exist in our society. And so then he says, Babaji says, my master has said that generally women do not require this meditation as they are comparatively free from the restless tendencies. Charji laughs, and there's laughter. Since my master said it, I won't question it. Laughter. But if a sister is a victim of such tendencies, of course now this is quite prevalent, then she may be advised to follow the process with a slight modification in the process. She should think that all divine gifts are available to her, and that all men and women of the world think they are brothers and sisters, and that her thought is one with theirs. And in the charge he says, it's a rather convoluted way of achieving the same thing. She doesn't think that all men and women are her sisters. She thinks that she doesn't think all men and women are her sisters and brothers, he should say here. She thinks divine blessings are coming to her, that all men and women of the world are meditating on this thought, that they are all brothers and sisters, and that she is part of that thought. I think this is necessary in the case of women because, they are the propagators of the race. Through women, of course, humanity breeds, you see, If this tendency that all brothers and sisters and the tendency towards celibacy and all these things go too far and too many people, I mean, nowadays it may be desirable that the population is limited, but in the future it might not be so desirable. He has said this in other places, of course. So women are to practice the same technique on point A with meditation with a slight change. You will receive it in writing so that you can study it later. So again, here, that women who are to become mothers, and if they overdo this technique and lose any sense of sexual desire and become like this idea of becoming sannyasis and withdrawing from the world and not having a material world life, because this has been a problem in religious organizations. This idea that sannyasis in India are people who renounce all material life and they just wander around begging people for money. There's a sannyasi who came to Charji's door when I was getting one of my preceptor cleanings from a senior preceptor, Raja Kapalan, who was from the same region as Kamlesh. He was a very wealthy man that was very, he just had this, it was almost like he was kind of gone, like if you met the guy, like he was like just not present, like not there. It was very, he was a good Abhyasi and preceptor. And this sannyasi, they have these lines painted on their face and they wear a certain outfit. And they would go off to the jungles or do these things, right? And they would not participate in society, and Babaji really hammered them as being like dregs of society. And this guy comes to Charji's door, like, so I'm getting a preceptor sitting. And Raja Gopalan gives him 5 rupees. Now it's 60 rupees to $1. So this is like 10 cents, whatever it was back then, the exchange rate, 15 cents, 5 cents, whatever. And the sannyasi lights up with this big smile like he just won the lottery. Like it was some major amount of money for him. 5 rupees, right? I mean, barely anything. And the guy walks away just in complete bliss, and now he's supposed to be a spiritual seeker. And he was there at Charji's door. And no idea who Charji was because he lived in a nice, rich neighborhood. And, these guys are mostly Brahmin, the Brahmin caste, and Charji is also a Brahmin. But he had no idea that, the level of the ability of the system and the master that's inside this house. Charji was inside the house, and I was getting this sitting on the front porch. And, I thought about this quite a bit. You can see that this guy was supposed to be a spiritual seeker. He's wandering around. He's given up life. He doesn't have any, family, friends. Well, he's just wandering around, supposedly being a spiritual person. And he had this opportunity to be a real spiritual person. And he walked away with 5 rupees. And so, this is, again, what Charji said, deplored, that these people are a burden on society. These sannyasis, like Babaji talked about, did quite a bit. And Babaji also said that, he was giving a sitting to this person. It was a man in this life, but the person had just deep grossness. And he saw he often saw the past life that would create the grossness. And so he saw that this person in a past life was a woman who desperately wanted to be spiritual, that had wanted a spiritual life and wanted to be one of these sannyasi type people. And she left her kids by the creek, like a river, like in ancient India, rural ancient India, and just abandoned them and went out into the forest to meditate and become spiritual. And she could hear the kids crying as she left, right, as she went into the forest. And it formed such a deep samskara in this life as a man, like Babaji was giving the sitting. You see that it was holding the Abhyasi back. Like Babaji had to cut the samskara, and the person immediately jumped off a number of points. Jumped up, and in terms of their spiritual evolution. They went from being stuck at point 1 in this, this very dense samskara that they had from this bad decision they made, right? And so, but it's the beauty of the Sahaj Marg system where you can live a normal life and be a part of your material life, but find balance in your spiritual times, your meditation in the morning and this cleaning at night, and to balance out your material world with your spiritual, your desire for a spiritual life, right? But this person in a past life had neglected her motherly responsibilities, which of course is not spiritual. And so the Sahaj Marg system supports natural life and bringing naturalness into your life. So if you have obsessive thoughts, sexual thoughts, which is obviously a bigger problem today than it was even when Babaji introduced this, but it's always been some kind of a problem. It's always been an issue with spiritual organizations. Perversion ends up slipping into it. There's a technique that's given for people who are sincere practitioners who realize that this is a problem, that they're having sexual thoughts that are, and or, expression of those thoughts and fantasies, right? Because it's, both of those things. That is a problem for their spiritual evolution. Of course, as you get older, there's a reduction in levels of testosterone and things like this. So it just naturally, it should dissipate as well. But there are these techniques that are here. And again, not to be abused and not to be looked at as something where you're trying to extinguish your sexual proclivities. You're trying to balance them out. You're trying to bring, naturalness back to your, deviant thoughts, deviant tendencies that have been warped by society or your past life samskaras or whatever they are, that the cleaning is also working on this. I meant to talk about this with my brother. My older brother he was a womanizer, and he was a serial cheater. He had cheated on his wife, who was, my brother was like a second father to me. He was 17 years older than me. I came to live with him and his 3 sons and his wife for some time when I was in college. I lived there maybe about a year or so. And then I came back from the Virgin Islands with a girlfriend, and we came back broke. It was just a hard trip to the Virgin Islands. We were waiting. It was a whole thing. I've talked about this in the Journey series. And I stayed with my brother's wife and my nephews for a brief period of time, like a month. And we were never close, but I was the only one to call her when my brother left her for another woman. And so, I was probably pretty close to start. I was a couple of years from starting. So we got back from the Virgin Islands. I lived with this woman. She was a nurse, and we were engaged to be married, and, it was a whole thing. But she went through a counselor who told me about Sahaj Marg. So I was 29 when I found out about Sahaj Marg, 28, I just turned 29. And, the whole thing with my 28 and the Rahu period and all those things. And, my brother was living with this woman, this blonde woman who was much younger than his wife. And his wife was so mad. And he left on my younger nephew's birthday, who I had a dream about last night. We were at a gathering and he was mad at me, which is kind of interesting that I'm bringing this story up. But it was my middle nephew's birthday, and he just had, he was very quiet. He had speech problems when he was a kid. He had trouble talking, initially, and then, I think that all went away. But he had some, people who have trouble with their developing speech issues get very angry, and he was a middle child. And there's specific things in the middle children. Like I see things with this nephew and my middle daughter and my middle sisters. Right? There's lots of things that I see in my siblings, and then my kids, and then my nieces and nephews. Like similar. I think there's people in my family like my oldest son is very similar to my oldest nephew. Like there was a time where I looked at my son and I just saw my older nephew. They had similar teeth and face and just some mannerisms, quite different as people, but there was some similarities there. Like for a moment, it was like I was looking at my nephew, right? Like these genetic tendencies that go on in people, and often the middle children are the ones who get overlooked and they're angry. And they don't let things go. And so it was my nephew's 10th birthday or something, and my brother left his wife for another woman, which was, it did devastating effect on his family life, right? His kids and his wife and his family and just all these things. His sexual addiction. I just went and ate breakfast. I want to come back to my brother in a second. This is important because it talks about all these things. But I want to point out here that the Sahaj Marg system doesn't just lay down morality like the Ten Commandments or any of these other things, principles that you see in other religions and spiritual organizations. Babaji has specifically said that Sahaj Marg, like if you see the 10 maxims of Sahaj Marg, they're all what to do. Not, do not steal, do not covet thy neighbor's wife, do not, lie, do not whatever it is. The 10 commandments, right? They're all do nots. And do nots, the human mind does not process the word no on certain levels, the negative. And so we get into subconscious level and these other levels. When you're repeating these do nots, it doesn't hear the not part. So it doesn't work. This is on the subconscious level, on the spiritual level. You always want to verbalize things in the positive, what should do. And going back to this chapter on suggestions that are given during the transmission, which I've talked about in various videos recently, the positive suggestions that the Abhyasi would develop, love for God or whatever it is, right? Would develop these things that are inside people would be pulled out through these, these suggestions that would be there in the transmission, right? Always positive, always something to promote spiritual evolution. And so in the Sahaj Marg system, there isn't just, don't do this or do this, but there's the cleaning process. And then there are techniques like the ones that were just given here about dealing with deviant sexual tendencies, right? And so it's a wonderful system, like the best system to me, because the transmission gives you an experience of God, where books talk about God or preachers talk about God. And you might be able to feel God. God might be there in the church. It might be there in the temple. God is there. God is there, but you can, in some places, some churches and some temples and some whatever they might be, shrines and peace pagodas in these places, you can feel God's presence. It's just more palpable. It's more present, right? Like some places you go on vacation at sunset or sunrise, you feel God more intensely, right? It's just one of these things where there's a balance in the universe. When you're looking at a sunset, you just feel this divine bliss, this passing of divine love. But the Sahaj Marg system, it's even more. Like it's even the ashrams are like charged more than these other places, and the cleaning that helps people in the transmission really is just a boost that just doesn't exist in these other systems. But also when you have these deviant tendencies, there is these applications that can be done. And such was the case for my brother. So my brother left his wife for this woman, and she was a nightmare. She was crazy. Nobody liked her. My nephews didn't like her, especially my middle nephew for obvious reasons. Nobody in the family. She brought so much difficulty to already a bitter divorce type situation. And, with that, my brother started to tell me things about his marriage and how he cheated. He was writing this book called The Gift. And it was a book in which he, the main character, who was my brother, every year on his birthday he would go out and sleep with a different woman, like a new woman. Like every year he'd give himself this gift, like he would go out and get laid. It's something that he confessed to me that he was doing in his marriage. So they had been married 20 years or something like that, a lot of years. And I don't know, my nephew was in college and he got married because he got his girlfriend pregnant, who became his wife. He was probably 18, so they were probably married like 18 years, 19 years. And he would say that he had agoraphobia, which I wasn't aware of. I think my parents knew a little bit about it. My brother could only go like 3 or 4 miles away from his house. And so it was like the fear of, he had like this debilitating fear. My brother was a very aggressive, fighty type of, he'd been a bouncer for a while. He'd been, a warrior in Vietnam and these things. He was just like one of these kind of tough guys. And yet he had this debilitating fear, which he attributed to his wife and his marriage. And that once he was able to leave that situation, the agoraphobia went away. So that really pissed off his ex-wife, right, who had supported his agoraphobia and saw like he was having these panic attacks when he had to do these things. And he couldn't get he could only get jobs within a 3-mile radius of his house or whatever. And she had suffered through this, difficulty with him and bore him 3 kids. And, she was, I mean, definitely a real trooper as far as as my observation of the situation, only for him to leave her and for a blonde girl that was probably 15, 20 years younger than she was on my nephew's birthday. And so then I started asking him questions because there was a French woman who was a blonde French woman who was had a kid, and my sister-in-law was working the tennis courts. My brother got these jobs, these town jobs, at the park and rec department, and she was working the tennis courts. They had these clay tennis courts, and they had to have somebody there that would sit there and be there. There's a basketball court there we used to play basketball at. Sometimes there were games and things. The rims were a little bit low, so it was easier to dunk on and things. And there was a pond there, this mill pond park. I had worked at this place that opened up the town building, a job my brother used to have, and he wanted to move on to do something else. So I got up every morning at 5:30, and I would open up the town building. I eventually moved to an apartment. I was I was back at school in college, my second attempt at college. That was just down the road from my brother's house, and he was hanging out with this French woman, and I wouldn't have ever thought he cheated, right? Like I just never thought he would do that. Like it just, I had a higher opinion of my brother than was justified. In some ways, I was a part of their family. It was like he was cheating on me too, and my nephews. But I asked him. He said, "Yeah, he had a relationship with this French woman for a long time." And then I started a landscaping business with my brother's help. And there was this woman. She was kind of a partier. She was in her 30s. I was in my 20s or whatever it was. And she was, kind of. You could tell she was promiscuous. Like sometimes I was cutting her lawn, and like guys would be leaving her house. Sometimes they were like, just seedy looking guys, right? And when I first, whatever way that people contacted me, when I first came in contact with her and she wanted me to cut her lawn, I said my name, and she goes, "Are you Pete Romano's brother?" And she gave this look like, she knew him more than just knew him. But at that time, I didn't think he was cheating, right? But then when he's telling me all this stuff, about the book, The Gift, and these things, and this, I said, "Well, what about this woman?" Because I came home, next time I saw him, I didn't come home because I was living in an apartment. But some weeks went by, I went and saw my brother, and I said, "Oh yeah, I got this customer who knows you," and I said her name, and my brother like bit my head off. "Oh, I don't know who that is." Like just like he overreacted. He got really angry at me, and I was just like, "This person says they know you," and I said that. But he was mad at me, because he had slept with this girl, and I was talking about her, and in a way that like, because I didn't have a negative opinion about my brother, like this whole idea of the guy code, which I deplore. Where you're supposed to lie for your friends, and you have to lie to their girlfriends and their spouses, and I don't believe this to be. I would never do that. Like now, I don't agree with it. Right? Don't tell me about I don't want to know about your transgressions, because if somebody, if your loved one asks me about it, I'm going to tell them the truth, because I'm not getting fucking involved. I don't want to be involved, right? I had a roommate who was a cheater, and his girlfriend realized I didn't like to lie, and she would ask me about it, and like I was in this horrible position because I liked her. She was my friend, also, and even if I didn't, I didn't want to lie for anybody, and it was just. I mean, it's a thing that cheaters do, because it's not only them lying, but they drag everyone down with them, right? When you should just tell the person, just say, "All right, I want to go do something else." It's the greed of wanting to have something, a stable marriage and whatever it is, but also have something else and have both things. And it always ends badly. But my brother was more of an addiction, a sexual addiction. He had been with all these prostitutes when in Vietnam, and when he came back from Vietnam. So it was more than just, having affairs. I mean, it was hundreds of women. He dated this girl who was in college, the college I eventually would go to. And she was 18 years old, and she attempted suicide because, he said she loved her and these things. And of course, he was married with 3 kids. I mean, just, the problem of a womanizer, right? But I thought better of my brother than to think that he would sleep with this woman. And she was, like kind of, I mean, like just not, you wouldn't think of her as a quality woman or whatever it is, right? She was very slutty or whatever. But then when I asked my brother, this woman said she knows you, he bit my head off, right? So, I asked him about all these things, right? But then I knew that my brother had this, it was a problem. It was clearly a problem. And, I went to visit him. And the first time I went out, and he was in Great Barrington, New York, which is like close to Massachusetts, kind of in the very beautiful place. There's all these famous writers that had been there. I think Thoreau was there. The guy Melville who wrote Moby Dick. There's a whale. It looks like there's a white rock, like really bright, brilliant white rock that looks like a whale, like a big white whale. And people have attributed the guy who wrote Herman Melville, his writing this Moby Dick, to him seeing this rock. He was like a heroin addict or something. And so it's it's a little unclear, but I saw this rock and I'm like, wow, it does look like a big whale, right? And so my brother was out in this area. I went to visit him and we were fishing and it was sunset and I told him about Sahaj Marg and I just felt all this spiritual energy. My nephew, who's, there's probably my two favorite people is my grandfather and my nephew, my brother's youngest son, who just had really nice energy and just a, well-balanced person. He would probably be the person in my extended family that would be the most likely, other than my kids, to do Sahaj Marg. I always thought that he would be a good Abhyasi. But I told my brother about Sahaj Marg, and he started, and there was that moment. And then I came back, I think, another time because, I think it was 2 times. And my brother was, was early. He was just waking up. And there was a girl in his apartment who lived across the way, and she was 25 years old. And she had a boyfriend, and she was also kind of a little bit like, just not a quality woman. And my brother was flirting with her, and he was going to drive her to someplace. And then the girl decided to bring her boyfriend because, like, my brother thought he was going to sleep with her. And, he's like, my brother, I was in my 30s, so he must have been close to 50 years old. And he's dating a 40-year-old, this blonde woman. And we go to eat lunch somewhere. And my brother was talking, my nephew had told him this term called cock block, right? And my brother was saying that his girlfriend was blocking his chance to be with this girl across the way, and I'm looking at like this is a nightmare. Like his ex-wife is just hating him, his kids are hating him, and I'm like, fuck, bro, like what are you doing, right? I mean, I just like I could see this was a real issue for him. So we go to eat lunch, and he says cock block, and this girl was like crazy. She and him had ended up living, had lived below. Like I got an apartment, and my brother got an apartment in the same building. Of course, he had some kind of problem with the landlord. He threatened my landlord, who I was friends with, and the landlord was mad at me. And I'm like, I don't know, like Jesus Christ. And she had this. She was a painter. She had these weird paintings, and this painting was supposed to represent her and him, and it was kind of abstract. And they had a fight, and she cut it with a razor blade. And I'm like, dude, she's gonna freaking cut your nuts off in the middle of the night. Like she was crazy. She had these crazy tendencies. And he says cock block, and she immediately read or something. Like her jealousy radar came up, and he starts, explaining that it was a term that Jace said, but he just said it, right. And I, she saw me laughing because I thought it was hilarious, because he just was talking to himself almost, or he was, and he just said the word cock block, and I'm dying laughing because it's funny, and she must have picked up on that. And then we get back in the car together, and he goes, "Oh my God, I'm lying again. I can't believe I'm doing this. I mean, I want to get caught," like he said to me, right? And then we go back, and this girl, who he's supposed to drive, he made this promise to, he dumps her on me and her boyfriend. It was weird. And then it was out of my way. It was like way out of my way. And like, it was just one of those things I couldn't say no to. But I was like, fuck you, man. Like I came out and I told him about Sahaj Marg. And he got this gift that he would thank me for years for telling him about it, right? And, I come visit him, and he sticks me with his skank in this nightmare situation. And so, this is a real problem, like these addictions. And the reason I'm saying all this is that, there's this other story. So we go to the ashram for the first time. We're going to meet Master Charji. And, up to that point, my brother had never felt a transmission, and he was jealous, like, of me, and, like, this whole thing was weird. And I was just feeling the energy as we went to the ashram. It was like this powerful, like it was like this tractor beam. And I was like pulling myself, it was like my heart was pulling me to the ashram. but I could just feel the intensity and anticipation, and the energy at the ashram was spectacular. And so I got off the bus and I'm like, Pete, do you feel that? You got to feel that. And I was all excited. And he goes, look, asshole, I got a whole week at this shithole and I don't need any of your shit, right? Like, and I wasn't trying to I was hoping that he would feel the energy, like, but he was taking it like I was rubbing it in his face. But anyways, I got sick during the gathering, but I had this epic gathering, a normal gathering. But my brother met this French woman or Italian woman. I think she was French. She had black hair. She looked Italian, but I think she was French. And they were hanging out the whole time. And, weight like was very obvious, right? Like, and like this is what he got. Like, I had this spiritual experience and he had this woman that he sort of was, had this 1 week relationship with, and they hung out for a whole week, and he had started meditating with this other woman who was still, I think, kind of just breaking up with or whatever his thing was. But that's what he got. And of course, he had this other woman that he dated, and she was a coworker. He worked counseling vets, and she was in a really bad marriage. And I was over at my brother's house, and he was cleaning out his car because they were going to drive together. And he was cleaning out like he was going on a date with this woman who was still married and much younger than him. And like he goes, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm like, it's like I'm going on a date. But he ended up hooking. They traveled somewhere together, and they hooked up in the hotel. And then she became an Abhyasi. But I had Thanksgiving with them, and she was a good cook, and she prepared, like, we were vegetarians at the time, a vegetarian Thanksgiving with vegetarian gravy, and it was like really great. My brother's bragging about her. And then they were talking about how she was struggling to start Sahaj Marg. Like, she wanted to do it, but she was worried that as a Christian, that she would go to hell if she deviated from the Christian religion because of the Christian teachings. And my brother he said to me, like, she's worried that she's going to lose her soul, Paul. You know what that means? Do you know what that means to her? Like, he's really intense about it. And I'm like, dude, I'm not the one trying to fucking indoctrinate her. Like, you're the one who's pressured her to be an Abhyasi, right? Because my brother had said to me later on that he always had women to cook for him or whatever it was. Like, he always ended up, he was a womanizer, right? And he got her to start Sahaj Marg, and they were together a little bit in the caretaker's cottage, and there was a hippie woman who had been very promiscuous, and she had grown up in Morbin, and she was very, she had a very deviant sexual life, and then now she was repenting, and she went to Master Charji saying that my brother and this woman were having they weren't married and they were having sexual relations. And I didn't know this went on. And Charji said, my brother comes up to me and says, I got good news, and it's not what you think. And I'm like, I don't think anything. What are you talking about? And he said that Charji had told him to go back to his ex-wife and this woman to go back to her ex-husband. And they both tried to do it. It didn't work. The people like looked at him like they were crazy, right? Because they both had contentious divorces, right? But it worked out to some extent with the kids, and like it actually had some benefit. But the girl's looking at me, my brother's girlfriend, and she comes up to talk to me later, and she goes, I saw the look on your face, and she goes, Peter isn't telling the whole story, and she told the whole story about this woman, this reformed slut who was now legislating these things, and went to Charji, and Charji brought them in, and he said, this person brought this to my attention. It's not really in the way of Sahaj Marg. And so what are we going to do about it? And Charji was leaving it open for my brother to say, we'll get married. Because if they were married, it would be perfectly fine, right? But my brother didn't want to marry this girl. He didn't really like her, and I knew this. And, he was just using her. And so Charji left them, my brother, the opportunity to say, she was waiting for him to say, well, we'll get married. Like, he was looking at him and saying, what are you going to do about this? And so some time went by, and so my brother said, well, what should we do? Like, he didn't say step up. Like, the obvious answer is we'll get married. But he didn't want to do that. And Charji was kind of fleshing that out. And my brother, Charji said, go back to your whatever they were, your former marriage, your former spouses. And this woman, accosted me in the middle of the night, 2:00 in the morning, when I was having, I was going to get this sitting from Kamlesh in 2012. So that happened probably maybe 6 or 8 years before that. And I hadn't seen her since, but she showed up at this gathering, and she had confronted my brother at like the bathroom with this. He was hanging out with this Indian girl, who I guess they're good friends with. I don't know if they have a sexual relationship or not. They're friends. And this woman confronts him, and then she dumps all this stuff on me about how horrible he was. And he had gone down to he went from Connecticut and drove this woman's car with his ex-girlfriend, the blonde one, that he left his wife for. And she had only taken one sitting from Fred the preceptor, and she was so messed up she couldn't meditate, and she was so restless that she couldn't come back for the other sittings, and she opened her eyes during the satsang, and she couldn't complete the meditation. So my brother gave her her second and third sitting. Like, he should have started her over. She probably maybe even needed more than 3 sittings. But he brought her down to the ashram in his girlfriend's car. And, and he just, all these stories she's telling me about the guy, like these horrible things, right? And I'm like, he's not a good guy. Like, I'm trying to tell her. I'm like, sitting there, I'm like throwing up and having diarrhea, and I'm just like weak. It's 2 o'clock in the morning, and she's just dumping all this stuff on me, right? But there was a time, and the reason I'm saying all these things is that there was a time when my brother became a preceptor, and he said he felt numb from the waist down, that he just wasn't having any sexual feelings. And I don't know, had Chargy saw something in him, or it just happened naturally. But he just, his proclivities towards this type of behavior had disappeared. Like, he just was numb. Like, he just didn't feel, he couldn't feel anything below his, like, he was like, he was paralyzed almost. Like, he said, I don't feel anything. Like, he's just, it was like some drastic measure had to be done to him because of his sexual proclivities, and that he was a caretaker of the ashram. And so, like, even with that, he still had some mental tendencies that were there, but the physical feelings that he used to have were no longer, the urges were no longer there. Like he said, I'm just, from the shoulders down, I'm numb. And I was like, yeah, that's probably a good thing, And so, again, like, this is, it happened in a more natural way. And I don't think my brother would have done the technique. I don't think he wanted to get rid of those tendencies. Of course, he was in his 50s and 60s or whatever. But, it was an obvious problem for him. He had a sexual addiction. It caused him a lot of pain. It caused the people in his family, his life, a lot of pain. And it was clearly blocking his spiritual evolution. And he would get distracted, and he would, this was an obvious problem for him. But in the Sahaj Marg system, there's a solution. So there just has to be a willingness. But also, again, it has to become something where you have deviant tendencies, and then it has to go back to being something more natural. There's a preceptor who had, and this woman, I later found out, like, this was a preceptor I traveled with, her husband, to the ashram, and he used to be gay, but then he married her. And I don't know the specifics. I think they're still married. But she said she was giving sittings to a guy who used to be gay, or he was gay, and he started to have feelings for women. Like, he was with the cleaning process. Of course, in the Christian tradition, they have all these things that they do to try to make gay people ungay. Like, they try to force the gayness out of them. They pray about it, and they bring them to these camps, whatever, their parents, this whole thing. And it's very forceful, and it doesn't work, and it's disrespectful to the people. But this will happen just from the cleaning process. And she didn't even know, when she was giving this guy sittings, that he had been gay. It was weird that she had married a husband like that, because she never talked to me about that, but I later found out that her husband had been gay, and like, he was doing Sahaj Marg, and he ended up marrying somebody. I don't know if he was bisexual. I don't know what it was, but this guy was gay, and he started saying to her, from the cleaning process, I'm starting having sexual feelings towards women, right? So, there's things that exist in the human frame from some scars, past lives, all these types of things. And there's some things that deviate away from the ideal, which is a marriage between a man and a woman that are, loving and, monogamous, and, all these things. The ideal, like the ideal relationship for a spiritual person is, a monogamous relationship with a person of the opposite sex. And, that ideal needs to be there, and whatever, sexual activity that there is there in the relationship, through the love of the people for each other, and these things, expression of their love, is the best case scenario. So, these techniques that are here, there has to be a level of understanding and maturity. That's why I've given this long interpretation of all the, I think pretty much all the knowledge of this that I have for all these things, right? That there is, there's Chargy uses the word deplore, that we deplore running away from life in Sahaj Marg. There's a naturalness to your life. So this idea of celibacy, running away from, a job and a family and these things, there needs to be a naturalness there. But also there are deviant tendencies, especially of the sexual nature, that exist in the human system, and people are all exposed to those things, the hyperization, the hyper, use of sex in advertising, and 1/3 of the internet is pornography, and a lot of it is, it's gross, starts off gross and gets worse, it gets more and more deviant and more, deplorable in these things. And so both things are there, right? The need for a natural relationship, not running away from it the way that spiritual people do. There was, and I'm not sure about this part, but like I know it to be true. I don't know the exact story of it. But Chargy was St. Paul in a previous existence. And somebody asked him why he wasn't liberated as St. Paul. And he said that St. Paul castrated himself because he wanted to have no sexual feelings and something like that, right? I don't know the exact, but his feeling that these, these deviant, or it was just maybe normal sexual feelings. So there was something there where he, was, he did something unnatural to deal with a problem or what he saw as a problem, whatever it might be. So this is always a big thing. We know that there's a connection between deviant sexual behavior and spiritual and religious organizations. The Dodgy Truther just sent me something that was these, it talked about these godheads, the people in India all loving to worship human beings that claim to be masters and gurus, and how so many of them have misused their people. Some of them have been accused of sexual abuse and things like that, just like priests. It was like a little short, kind of weird, Indian video and a trailer to a movie about this, a famous situation like this, right? And it talked about, Indian people, this is someone who was cynical, that maybe didn't believe in God. All those things are creeping in across all these civilizations, and it's very easy to see a piece of shit like Dodgy, right, who, is just betraying people's trust in God and trust in spiritual masters and gurus. And there are real people that achieve these things, but there's always a chance, a tendency to fall spiritually, to be pulled away through desire for fame or money or, some sexual activity or whatever it is, right? There's always these things that can creep in, and there has to be some sense of discipline and some sense of awareness that human beings have these tendencies, and nobody's above these types of things, that you have to, whatever your specific frame or makeup is in your human system, your weaknesses, your some scars, your potential downfalls, and you have to be aware of them, not obsessed with them, not making them bigger than they are, but knowing that these things exist, not to be ashamed of them, not to have some sense of, guilt and shame that only make things worse, but knowing that there's tools available in the system and using those tools appropriately, not to go too far in the other direction where you become celibate or something like this. You lose something that there's these two sides of the coin that are both unnatural. A proclivity towards perversion, to sexual perversion, and also the opposite of that, where there's nothing at all in celibacy and you shut down something that's natural and a part of human life, right? There has to be the happy medium, the balance, moderation. And Sahaj Marg is all about moderation, like now what's natural, what's appropriate, and finding that for yourself and all these things. And so, again, this is all the knowledge that somebody needs. All the information to understand exactly how these techniques are supposed to be used. Whatever these techniques are, they're not to be used to run away from life or any of these things. They're supposed to help naturalize and divinize your tendencies and bring out a higher version of yourself that functions on the most pristine and the most sense of almost innocence and just the innocence of your soul, and just behaving without any of these grosser tendencies. A clean person who's living a life the way it's meant to be lived on a spiritual level. So I think there's one more technique, the meditation on point B, I think it is, which I'll cover again. It's coming up in the next section. Probably not tomorrow, but in a couple of days. But I think this is, really important for people. And again, being disciplined and having just, people are crazy, and I do my best to make sure people understand, how these things are and what they're about, and all these things that I've talked about here in the story. I mean, Chargy was already doing that in this book for Babaji, and then I've added more context to all these things, right? But people still will have these tendencies to misuse things or whatever. And so when you're using these techniques, this idea of some sort of balance and moderation and praying and having, evolving the use of any of these techniques. There's somebody who was taking an individual sitting a day instead of doing their own meditation, right? And you're only supposed to have one individual sitting a week. If you're going through something more, of course, there's the intensive, or if you've stopped for a while, there's the introduction. I'm going to redo all these videos. Again, this is Wednesday, December 4th, 2024. At some point, I'm going to redo the introductory videos and the intensive sittings, because I feel like the sittings are now getting better. The use of this book and things, and I feel, evolving as a preceptor. And so the sittings will be replaced at some point, but they still work now. And so if you're going through something intense, sure, take one sitting a day or these 3 sittings in one day. I mean, all these things are available to people, but not to be abused, right? Not to replace your own, your responsibility to meditate on your own and connect without the sittings, because that's part of your job, right? Like everything has, and the lack of preceptors. That's why listening to the introduction to these videos and things over and over again, you use these techniques in the spirit that they're intended. There's a time that Chargy gave some technique at a gathering, and he said, I give you these things for you to use. These things are out there and you guys don't use them, but then don't overuse them either, right? So there's just a balance. But he was joking about it, but he said, these things are there, but you guys hear it and you're like, oh, that's great, and then you don't use them, right? And so, identifying the issue, not making it bigger than it is, using the technique the way it's designed, and perfecting it, and just seeing how you use it and the time length. You might not want to do it every night or whatever it is, and just finding a nice happy balance, and then changing your behavior, your character behavior, and not indulging in things that are going to cause more samskaras and more grossness and these things, right? Just taking some responsibility for your choices. And all these things have to do with moderation. Of course, Chargy gave that great talk about morality being the proper utilization of resources, which is a great definition for morality. You have these resources, you have the sexual energy, this creative force, and it has a purpose, of course, procreation being the main purpose, and then also it's an expression of love and intimacy between two, a married couple, and so using it for the way that it's designed. Okay, so I think that's everything I have to say on this subject, and I hope people, will come back and re-listen to this whole thing, maybe use the technique for a couple of months and then listen to the whole explanation again, and, maybe you gain some knowledge and whatever, some perspective from meditating on this and praying. You're praying for some help with the problem that is blocking your spiritual evolution. In this case, sexual perversion, right? Only spirituality will save this world. It's Pranhuiti, definitely point for the Apocalaughs and the Ascension. Everyone have a blessed day and be grateful.